In today's video, I'll be talking about the exact settings I use to create incredible time lapses on the GoPro Hero 9 Black. Now before we begin, if you're looking for a video on the best settings for a night lapse, I've linked to my video on this above, and you can check that out. This video will be focused on the best settings for time lapses that occur between dawn and dusk. So for time lapses on this camera, you have two main options. The first option is using the video mode. The second option is using the photo mode. The primary difference is the video mode will assemble all of the images into a single video file that you can then export from the camera and share. The photo mode, on the other hand, will provide you with hundreds or thousands of individual images that you will then edit and assemble into a video. Both options produce great results on this camera, and each has their own use case. I'll begin with the best settings for shooting a time lapse using the video mode. First thing we're going to do is power on the GoPro. Then you'll want to make sure you're in the time lapse mode. Once you're in the time lapse mode, you're going to click on the button here at the bottom with the settings. And you're going to select time lapse. Once you get into the menu here, you're going to see several different settings. The first one we want to change, since this is the video mode, is format here in the middle. And we're going to want to change this to time-lapse video. This will then unlock some options that were grayed out before. For the first option here, resolution, you want to set that to 4K. For the lens, you'll have a few options on here. I currently have mine set to linear. However, if you click on that, you can set that to wide, linear, or narrow. Now I recommend that you select either linear or wide, as narrow is too narrow. So if you select linear, it's going to remove the fisheye, and you won't have any fisheye to correct when you're editing. I recommend linear anytime you're like doing a cityscape or something with buildings where you want those lines to be straight and not having that weird fisheye bow to them. However, if you're doing landscapes, wide can be excellent for landscapes. I often use wide for landscapes and really like that setting because it has a wider field of view. So you're going to get more in that time lapse. So let's stick with wide for now. For the interval, you're going to have a couple options. You'll have a range of 0.5 seconds all the way up to 60 minutes in between photos. That is quite a range. Depending on what type of time lapse you're doing will depend on how much of an interval you want, but generally I recommend aiming for the 2-second to 5-second interval. In fact, 5 seconds is my favorite interval. I find that one to be most useful for most of my daytime time lapses. 2 seconds can be ideal if you're just doing a couple-hour time lapse. It'll get more frames in there. 2 seconds is good if you have something with a lot of fast motion in it. 5 seconds is good for things that are moving a little slower. So this often comes into play with clouds. If you're shooting a daytime time lapse and you've got clouds that are moving fairly slowly, it can be a good idea to use the 5-second interval. If you're shooting something like a sunset, I recommend doing the 2-second interval because it'll capture a lot more of those details that can change rapidly at sunset or sunrise. So I recommend having the 2-second interval because you're going to capture a lot more of that detail. For the scheduled capture, we're going to set that to off. The duration, we're going to do no limit. For the timer, that will be off, and zoom, we'll leave that at 1. For the bitrate, you want to make sure that's set to high. That's going to capture the most detail in your time lapse, and you definitely want that. For EV comp, you want to set that to negative 0.5. It's a good idea to have the exposure compensation a little lower than 0 because GoPros can tend to blow out some of the whites especially. And if you have that a little bit below 0, it's going to capture more detail in those shadows and highlights. For the white balance, I recommend setting this to 5500K for a daytime time lapse. That's going to be the white balance that works for a lot of daytime time lapses. Ultimately, the key is that you don't set it to auto, otherwise your white balance could change on you in the middle of a time lapse, and it'll be very difficult or near impossible to correct that later on. So if you keep it set to a specific value there, you can always adjust that later on when editing, and it's not hard to do. For the ISO minimum, you want to set that to 100. And for the ISO maximum, you also want to set that to 100. You don't want your ISO changing on you in the middle of a time lapse. So by setting both values to 100, you're guaranteed to keep that ISO consistent, which is excellent for anytime you have changing light, like sunlight and then clouds going over the sun or sunsets. It keeps that lighting consistent and the results look really good. For sharpness, you want to keep that at low. And then for color, you have 2 options. My advice is if you don't want to edit the time lapse at all, and you just want it in a single file that you can share, keep it at GoPro for the color. GoPro Color Science does a pretty good job with interpreting the colors really well, and it tends to saturate the sky especially well. So if you want a really deep, rich blue sky, the GoPro coloring is going to do a great job for you. However, if you want to edit the coloring and saturation in post, then you'll want to change this to flat. Flat's going to offer you the most flexibility. It's going to undersaturate most of those colors, and it's going to give you the option to bring out the colors that you really want to in the finished product. So again, if you don't want to edit it, keep it at GoPro. If you do want to edit it, I recommend going to flat. And for the shortcuts section, we're going to leave that alone, as that will not apply to this. Here's a recent time lapse I created using the video mode. Next, let's talk about the best settings for shooting a time-lapse using the photo mode. Once again, we're going to go to the time-lapse mode. Once you've selected that, you're going to click Edit. And once you're into the settings, you're going to select Format on the right-hand side. You're going to change that to time-lapse photo. This is going to gray out some of the options. For instance, lens on the left, you have to use wide lens for the photo mode. There is no other option for that. For the interval, you're going to select that. And the options for interval are going to be a little bit more limited in photo mode. The lowest you can go is 5 seconds. And the highest you can go is all the way up to 60 minutes. So for photo mode, I definitely recommend sticking with the 5 seconds. This will give you the maximum amount of photos and the most flexibility later on when you're editing this time lapse. Next option is output. I highly recommend selecting RAW for output. By selecting RAW, you're going to get the highest quality photo with the most detail in it. This is key because later on when you want to edit the individual photos, you're going to have the most detail there available to really select what you'd like to bring out in the time lapse. Now for editing the raw photos, I do use Adobe Lightroom, but there are other options as well. But I highly recommend Lightroom because you can select your settings on one of the photos, and then you can sync those same settings to hundreds or thousands of photos really easily. This will keep a consistent look to your time lapse. For the next option, the scheduled capture, we're going to make sure that is cleared. For duration, you'll want to make sure that's set to no limit. For timer, we're going to keep that off, and zoom, we're going to keep that set to the default. Under the Pro Tune options, I recommend keeping EV Comp at the -0.5. This will capture the most detail in your photos and helps prevent the highlights or the shadows from being blown out with too much white. For the white balance, I recommend keeping that at 5500K. Again, you can change the white balance later on when editing, but just make sure you do not keep the white balance at auto. 5500K I find works best for most daytime time lapses. For ISO minimum, you want to make sure that's set to 100, and for ISO max, you want to make sure that's also set to 100. This is going to help ensure the camera does not switch ISOs on you, which could look very weird in a time lapse. Keeping the ISO the same is going to give you the best results. For sharpness, you want to keep that at low. You can always add sharpness later on when editing, but it's very difficult to take the sharpness away. For color, I recommend keeping that at flat. That's going to give you the maximum amount of flexibility, especially since you're editing raw photos. Raw photos offer a lot of flexibility, so keeping the color at flat gives you a lot of power to selectively add colors later on. And then we get down to the shortcut settings, which do not apply to this. Here's a recent time lapse I created using the photo mode. If you're looking for an in-depth tutorial on how I edit time lapses, I've linked to one above. If you found this video to be helpful, please hit that like button. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, I'd love to have you on board. Please hit the subscribe button and the bell so that you'll be notified each time I publish a new video. Until we talk again, happy time lapsing.